Good evening and welcome. My name is Kathleen Bush and I'm the Manager of Community Relations here at King's. And I'm online with Ashley Patton there with the red hair, and she's working things from behind the scenes. So for those of you who are new to our lecture series, we began offering these lectures online last spring to meet the needs of our alumni and supporters for access to King's quality education. King's President Melanie Humphreys and I had the pleasure to tour BC and Alberta last year as part of our 40th anniversary tour, and we spent a good portion of our time listening to our constituents. And one of the things we heard, especially from our teacher graduates, is a need for professional development. So this series, Educating for Life, was birthed out of those conversations and our desire to meet that need. You can find our other lectures on our King's YouTube page under, you have to put The King's, so The King's University, and then public lectures. This lecture will also be recorded with Dr. Mahaffy's permission and will be available online in about a week or so to use for group professional development at schools and for those in our communities that are in different time zones, or if they missed it. So welcome everyone tonight for tonight's lecture, Educating for Life lecture with Dr. Peter Mahaffy. Dr. Mahaffy will be sharing on educating for complexity, change, uncertainty, and resilience, lessons from the pandemic. Dr. Mahaffy will be asking an important question throughout this lecture. Should we go back to normal? Or are there fundamental ways we should re-examine education to better equip students for resilience and thriving in the midst of uncertainty, fear, complexity, and change? Tonight, we're also joined by two alumni who will be helping to facilitate the lecture. Ruben Mahaffy, a King's alumnus and now teacher, will be fielding the questions at the end of Dr. Mahaffy's presentation. You could private chat any questions to him throughout the lecture or at the end, and he will present them to Dr. Mahaffy. Ruben had the pleasure of taking several classes with Peter during his time at King's, where Peter helped to kindle his love of science. That is, of course, in addition to lots of informal science education that took place earlier on in life at home when Dr. Mahaffy was just dad. Ruben is honored to have had an exemplar role model of what exceptional teaching is long before he ever had his first official class at King's. Also joining us tonight is Mackenzie Tilstra. Mackenzie graduated in 2019 with her bachelor's in science in chemistry, where she took almost every class that Dr. Mahaffy taught, as well as summer research with Dr. Mahaffy. Mackenzie is now pursuing a master's in science in public health at the U of A, where she studies the effects of climate change and air pollution on the health of Edmontonians. Mackenzie will be introducing Dr. Mahaffy tonight. She knows him very well after being in so many of her classes. Or his classes. You may also recognize Mackenzie as she was our student speaker last year at our Harvest Banquet, where Mackenzie helped us raise $50,000 in one evening for student scholarships. So Mackenzie, I'm going to hand this over to you for your introduction to Dr. Peter Mahaffy.
Thanks, Kathleen. So yeah, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Peter Mahaffy is a professor of chemistry at the King's University in Edmonton, and he is currently in his 40th year of teaching there. He is also the director of the King's Center for Visualization in Science, or KCVS, where he's worked with a number of talented colleagues and a team of interdisciplinary students to provide interactive digital learning resources used by over 500,000 students, educators, and the public from over 100 countries each year. His current research and professional work is at the interfaces of systems thinking in chemistry education, the uses of interactive visualizations to facilitate learning in science, sustainability and green chemistry, and the responsible use of chemistry. He recently co-chaired the IUPAC Task Force on Systems Thinking in Chemistry Education, which has spawned a new project on systems thinking in chemistry for sustainability. Dr. Mahaffy is a past chair of the IUPAC Committee on Chemistry Education, a charter member of the International Council of Science Committee on Freedom and Responsibility in the Conduct of Science, and the Temporary Working Group on Education and Outreach for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, which received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2013. He has served on the American Chemical Society Presidential Working Group to help professional chemists communicate climate science to the public, and has co-authored a general chemistry text and 50 refereed publications on science and science education. He was selected as a 3M National Teaching Fellow and has received multiple awards for his work in chemistry education. Dr. Mahaffy has also been married to Cheryl Mahaffy for 45 years and is celebrating life with 3 gifted and caring adult children, Ruben, Naomi, and Miriam. And he will tell you that almost nothing is as much fun as being a grandfather of 3. During my years at King's, Dr. Mahaffy taught me more than any other professor, and while he is known by his students for all the amazing work I've already mentioned, I think I'm in a position to say that he is also known by his students for his commitment and faith in their abilities, his love of the outdoors, poetry, and art that permeated any class we took with him, and his distinct wit, wordplay, humor in the form of puns all the time, anywhere he could fit them. For me personally, he is an amazing teacher and mentor who fostered my passion for working in climate change, and I am really honored to introduce him to everyone who's here this evening. Thank you.
Let me see if I can share my screen. Thank you very much, Mackenzie, for that generous introduction. You've left me just a little bit of time now for my presentation. I'm really delighted to see that King's is launching this virtual public lecture series to reach out to our community of support, which is a key reason why King's is thriving in the middle of the incredible complexity of multiple pandemics. So, lessons from a pandemic. But first, I'd like you to be actively involved in this presentation. And so I'm going to ask even the colleagues who are older than I am to pull out a smartphone or to open another tab on your browser. All of you have a computer, I know, because you're watching Zoom. And to go to www.menti.com to see whether you are, to see if you know what IUPAC means. That's one thing that Mackenzie said in her introduction. So www.menti.com. Ashley, maybe you could drop that into chat for everybody. And the code is 4986457. And I'd just like to know a little bit about who's behind the Zoom windows. I recognize lots of familiar faces and names. But I'd like to know who we are collectively, and Menti is completely anonymous. I use it quite a bit in my teaching as a way to try to get large classes to actively engage in what we're doing. And I know how many of you there are on the Zoom call, and I know how many people have responded on Menti, so we can just wait until everybody tells us who you are, or most of you. So we have some faculty, staff, students, alumni. The board and Senate is coming, supporting community, and lots of others. So if you're new to King's particularly, I'd really like to welcome you. A couple more questions. Here's the second one. How familiar are you on a scale of 1 to 5 with the King's vision statement, the beautiful world of atoms and molecules, systems thinking, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and the Planetary Boundaries Framework? And the thumbs are moving a little faster on the smartphones now. Okay, so at the top of the list is the King's vision statement, still a 3 out of 5. The beautiful world of atoms and molecules, that's my challenge for tonight for 50% of you, 49% of you, right? 48% of you. Systems thinking, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and then a sustainability framework that perhaps is less familiar to you, the Planetary Boundaries Framework. Last question at the beginning is a very straightforward one. What do you think is the most important technological invention of the 20th century, of the last century? The most important technological invention of the 20th century. And here's what you're coming up with. The internet, computers, the washing machine, the World Wide Web, internal combustion engines, antibiotics, electronic computation, fertilizer. And I see some King's students who have taken introductory chemistry with us because I see the Haber-Bosch process appearing. Okay, thank you for your responses, and we're going to come back to that. I was enormously grateful to King's for the gift of a sabbatical research leave last year. And I worked on a number of projects. I've identified just a few of them here. One of them was directing the work of the King Center for Visualization in Science that Mackenzie mentioned. And over the last 2 summers, we've had a team of 6 students working full-time each summer to create these interactive learning resources. And you'll see at least one of them tonight. One of the most recent projects has been funded by Energy Efficiency Alberta before they were disbanded. And it's a project on moving into a solution space with climate change, trying to move from understanding and despair to hope with an interactive resource that allows you to engage with what you actually can do with currently available technology to get down to the Paris Accord targets. And then I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about the work that we're doing on systems thinking and sustainability. And woven into all of this in a few places are some results from becoming a student again. I was just absolutely delighted and a little bit terrified to go back into the classroom again as a student, spring term, and take a poetry course with Julie Robinson, which I thoroughly enjoyed. So we're busy educating for life at King's this fall again, and it isn't easy with new and often really complex modes of learning. But I'm incredibly grateful to the resilient and dedicated students who embrace learning that's transformational, who work to build community under really difficult circumstances with mask-to-mask and camera-to-camera learning. These are students in my environmental chemistry of soils and water class. We moved to an evening Tuesday night for 3 hours so that we could meet face-to-face the whole time, and a lab on Thursday afternoons. And I've experienced many moments of grace and beauty this term in the world of teaching and learning at King's. One stands out for me. We worked very hard to find some safe ways during COVID to teach from creation, not just about creation, which is one of the mantras in our science program at King's. And so in my environmental chemistry course, we were able to go out on the very first Saturday of term to characterize a lake northeast of Edmonton that hadn't been characterized before, to measure fundamental water parameters, to try to understand them, and then to present a report to the community at the lake. And this was all made possible by my retired colleague, I think he's retired anyway, John Wood, who's a limnologist and is happier doing almost nothing than on a boat on a lake measuring parameters. And so here are the students with their remote lab set up on the shore, looking at all sorts of parameters, working very hard for quite a few hours, and then taking the rest of the Saturday off. So faculty, staff, alumni, supporting community, we're all working together to help King's more fully live out our vision. That's the promo for this Education for Life lecture series. And we're doing that this year with some real disappointments, some challenges due to COVID-19. And one of the really large disappointments to me personally is that some of the changes we've needed to make to routines with the novel coronavirus are that we've been unable to meet in person to thank some incredibly dedicated colleagues who have retired since COVID restrictions were put in place. And these are colleagues who I admire deeply, who really live out for me what it means to educate for life. And many of them have dedicated much of their professional lives to King's. And so I would like to dedicate this lecture tonight to 5 of those colleagues who retired since COVID. And one is Harry Spaulding, professor of environmental studies and geography, Lloyd Den Boer in education and the Dean of Education, Joachim Seger in music, Doug Herring, who we will not put out to pasture just yet. He retires at the end of this term. And then Hank Bestman, a dear colleague in the science faculty who also stepped up to the plate and helped to give, along with other members of the leadership team, incredible leadership as we navigated the choppy waters of COVID as an institution. So to all of you, dear colleagues, hats off, thank you. And we look forward to having a proper rip-roaring party at some point after we have vaccines. But I would like to invite you just to go back to Menti for a moment and www.menti.com. And I'd like to invite you to put in 1 to 3 words that capture for you the contribution this group, you may not know all of them, of recently retiring faculty have made to educating for life. So perhaps not including names, but just using words that capture what you know of this group. And then at the end of my talk, I'll open this slide again and invite you to add some more thoughts if you haven't had a chance to do that yet. And then I'd like to print this out and frame it and give it to each one of my 5 colleagues. Okay, so I'll leave it up for just a moment and then we'll go back to the presentation and I will leave this open. So if you have Menti open, you can finish your thoughts and I will show you what you have written at the end of the talk. So maybe Ashley, remind me if you would. All right, so I've organized my talk with 5 threads. One is flourishing and the King's vision statement and what it means to me. The second is the incredible challenges that have been posed by teaching and learning during the pandemic. Systems thinking, so a global initiative, systems thinking in STEM education that I've had the real privilege of helping to lead over the last few years, and then thinking about what systems thinking might mean for the world of molecules and atoms, developing the idea of the molecular basis of sustainability, which I'd like to unpack a little bit for you tonight. And then finally, I'd like to end with some examples, really concrete examples of a few things that we're doing in our chemistry classes right this term to try to embody that theme and use systems thinking. Okay, when I think of our vision statement at King's, to be widely known as a Christian university serving to build a more humane, just, and sustainable world, I think of flourishing. And I'm really grateful to be in a faith-based community that puts the flourishing of students and our planet up front in everything that we do. And I'm equally grateful for the flourishing that has been brought to my life by 45 years with Cheryl. And that image of flourishing was taken at the end of the summer when we escaped to a high pass in the Rockies, one of the places that we both love. That's flourishing. But what does it mean for our learning community to flourish when there are so many signs that the physical, living, and human planet is groaning, not flourishing? Even the color of our world is groaning instead of thriving. And some of you will know what you're looking at here. 26% of you, I think it is. I used to think, as a chemist is wont to do, of polarizing forces, which we often represent as red and blue, as being the beautiful glue that keeps much of our biophysical world together and results in things like hydrogen bonds that are important to the sparkling snowflakes we've seen over the last couple of days and to every biological process. So red and blue. But our planet is groaning. And after events of the last weeks, I look at maps of our neighbor to the south, and I'm not sure whether the colors of polarization represent death by coronavirus or death by political polarization. Our planet is groaning. And part of living out our vision is to tune our ears sensitively and discerningly into the groaning of our planet. And so I've been working over the past decade to tune in as a chemistry educator to the sustainability challenges faced by our Earth and societal systems. Challenges of biodiversity, moving toward perhaps a sixth mass extinction. Challenges of greenhouse gases and a climate crisis where our current concentrations of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, 411.15 parts per million, are greater than we have seen before in the existence of humans. We don't know a planet like this. And those greenhouse gases have led to many, many challenges for human beings, for biodiversity, for the life support systems of our planet. There was a summary of this in Nature 2 years ago of the global map of cumulative climate hazards that have and showing change between 1955 and moving forward to 2095. We think of surface temperature as being really important, that's in the media, but 467 traceable pathways for impacts on human health, water, food, economy, infrastructure, and security by multiple climate hazards. So we have a compelling need to listen to our planet groaning and to understand what it is that causes that groaning. And one of the ways the world is doing that is to rally around two sustainability agendas to bring visibility and appropriate strategies to address those global challenges. And one of them is more familiar to the group here, and that's the UN Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals, 169 targets requiring strategies to address 2030, which is a period of time that has been ambitiously set to try to deal with major sustainability agendas. And fundamental chemistry, the flow of matter and energy, is at the heart of almost every one of these, and I'll try to give you some examples of that that are quite concrete. And yet my colleagues, chemistry educators, pay relatively little or no attention to global sustainability agendas like the UN Sustainable Development Goals or the Planetary Boundaries Framework. This is a framework that was first published in 2009 in Nature magazine, catalyzed an enormous amount of interdisciplinary science work to try to guide human development on a changing planet. Another major paper came out in 2015. And the framework is a framework that establishes, articulates 9 Earth system processes: climate change, novel entities, stratospheric ozone depletion, atmospheric aerosol loading, ocean acidification, biogeochemical flows, freshwater use, land system change, and biosphere integrity, which includes loss of biodiversity. And the attempt is to bring together some of the best interdisciplinary scientific minds to move beyond concern and fear about what's happening, to really try to understand it, and to whatever extent possible, to try to identify control variables for each of these Earth systems, to understand where we are. Are we in the green, within the planetary boundary, a safe operating space for humanity? Or are we in a zone of increasing risk? Or have we passed into a zone of exceptionally high risk, shown in red? Two of the core boundaries in the last release in 2015 have been identified as core, two of the Earth systems. One is climate change and the other is biosphere integrity. And that's for two reasons. One is they're connected as a system to almost every one of the other 9 Earth systems. And on their own, each has the potential to drive the Earth system into a new state, should we continue to substantially and persistently transgress them. And so one of the things we've been taking on at the King Center for Visualization in Science is trying to create interactive visualizations that will engage the public and students with frameworks like the Planetary Boundaries Framework. And this is the group that was working last summer. In particular, I'd like to just single out here Rob McDonald, a physicist on our faculty who designed the visualization with the help of the students that you see here, and Melanie Hoffman, my colleague and fellow chemist, working with the Stockholm Resilience Center, which has developed the Planetary Boundaries Framework. And we have created an interactive learning resource. If you go to kcds.ca, you can find it there. And it's receiving a great deal of attention around the world right now. It's an interactive visualization of that Planetary Boundaries Framework. We've been addressing some of the limitations of that visualization that you saw. That framework has driven agendas like the Rio +20 summit that happened about 10 years ago now. The whole idea of resilience, the whole idea of quantifying what we do with respect to these Earth systems. And so this interactive visualization allows you to play these control variables over time and to watch what happens as you move from 1900 to 2010. And we're putting the data in to take it up to 2020. To take a single one and to highlight it and to look at the control variables for it, to understand how they change over time, to look at the processes, to look at their connections with other processes, and to identify now some curriculum links to all of those. In a few minutes, we're going to come and look at an example where the biogeochemical flows is particularly important, the amount of fixed nitrogen we create. And so with our planet already groaning under the weight of sustainability crises, our experience of teaching and learning and living and doing science has been seen through the eyes of COVID-19 now for the past 8 months. So how do we build a more humane, just, and sustainable world under the eye of COVID? The title for my talk tonight was inspired by a recent publication that came out in the Journal of Chemical Education with co-authors from Arizona, Vicente Talenquar, and 2 Australian co-authors, Bob Bucat and Roy Tasker. It was entitled Lessons from a Pandemic, Educating for Complexity, Change, Uncertainty, Vulnerability, and Resilience. And it seems to have struck a nerve. It was selected by the editors of the American Chemical Society as an editor's choice publication. So like me, you're sitting right now in front of a Zoom window, and after 8 minutes of, 8 months, not minutes, of life being massively disrupted by the COVID pandemic, you're maybe like me at times dreaming of getting back to normal quickly. This isn't much fun. But perhaps Indian novelist Arundhati Roy gives us pause. She writes, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one's no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And then she says, nothing could be worse than a return to normality. So enter with me for just a moment the world of chemistry education, even if it's new to you. You might recognize it, even if you're not very familiar with it. What would a return to normal look like in chemistry education? So in writing this paper, I went looking in the literature. What we teach our freshmen in chemistry, the Journal of Chemical Education. And what did I find? Well, here's an articulation of what we teach freshmen, first-year students in chemistry. It's a compromise between the largely descriptive chemistry, which has been incorporated into general chemistry courses during the past 20 to 25 years, along with ideas of physical chemistry. The result is an encyclopedic hodge, too extensive for thorough treatment in the time usually allotted, and so rich in multiplicity of slightly related details as to bewilder the earnest student. Perhaps that was your experience of chemistry, first-year chemistry in university. This is a paper published in 1924, the very first issue of the Journal of Chemical Education, when the world was emerging from a pandemic, the double whammy of the Spanish flu and World War I. And so in this paper, we ask the question, if we're made to suck on lemons, can we make lemonade? Can we use the rupture of the pandemic for deep reflection on how we educate in chemistry and STEM courses and our entire curriculum, and how we can educate for the world of complexity and change that our students face? So we have the feeling that our students in the last year, 8 months, have been incredibly stressed, seeing changes in their world that they are hopeless in the face of isolation, seeing parents, grandparents getting sick, elderly people dying, watching politicians step up to the microphone and make various pronouncements which have relatively little to do with the COVID virus and a lot to do with political agendas. And are we continuing just to educate as we always have? So what chemists have been very good at doing is educating for specialization in the pursuit of discovery. And this is a quote by Joseph Bordogna, who headed up the National Science Foundation. That specialization is incredibly important. But he suggests back in 1991, it's not enough for the skills we need of 21st century leaders. And I really liked his metaphor of fractionating knowledge. That's a metaphor that's really familiar to a chemist and someone who teaches organic chemistry. So here's a fractionating column. And what I do when I teach organic chemistry labs is we give complex mixtures to students, and then they have to learn how to distill those mixtures and separate those mixtures into individual components. And then we assess them based on how pure the individual components are. So in my poetry class, I wrote a poem about fractionating knowledge. Eager learners decant complex mixture, algorithms, concepts, mental models into round bottom flask. Metacognitive awareness pour in portions of themselves, prior knowing, personalities, passions, hopes, and fears. Teacher cranks up heat, stir bar spins and rattles, mercury rises, neurons fire, concepts reflux. Vapor ring hits cold condenser, drip, 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 glittering gemlets of knowledge, fractionated. Apprentices separate, analyze valued pieces, reward only isolation, purity, and yield. Outside, looking in, Anthropocene epoch blinks back tears, eagerly awaits reimagined beyond benign design of learning, interconnect fractions, envision a whole more than the sum of parts, conditions for molecular solutions to emerge, help the planet groan a little less and sing a little more. Fractionating knowledge. And so systems thinking, an approach that has been quite well known in some disciplines, virtually unknown in chemistry education. One approach that we think has real promise to move beyond fractionated knowledge. So systems thinking using tools, strategies, and cognitive frameworks to visualize interconnections and relationships among components of complex and dynamic systems, to examine how behavior of a system changes over time. And then a really interesting and challenging concept is how do systems level phenomena emerge from the interactions among the system parts? The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And applied to chemistry education, this global community has seen real potential to have this help in moving beyond presentation only of a myriad of isolated facts to a more holistic view of the discipline. But yet chemists and chemistry educators are often unfamiliar with the term systems thinking, and people who are engaged in systems thinking have very different understandings. Nailing down the concept is messy, it's inky, it's skittish, and yet it's really worth doing. And so in that same class, I thought I'd take the 5 key elements of systems thinking from the literature and illustrate what systems thinking might look like based on a system that's not a molecular system, but a system consisting of a jumble of letters, which make up the words systems thinking. And here are the elements, the essential features of systems thinking. System is a whole, not simply a collection of the parts. And to do systems thinking, we have to think, we have to understand how interactions among parts cause system behavior. And so let me take a poet's pen to that jumble of letters and add the constraint that we will make words that contain only the letters in systems thinking and only use the number of times they're in that word. And so we begin to pluck letters out of the heap and see how interactions among the parts cause system behavior. We look at how the system changes over time. And so we have emerging, eyeing, shiny, thingy, meshing, mining, hinting, kithing, sensing, sight-tying, thinkings, skittish, entity, stymieing, missing, messy, misty, smite, misthinks, emit, tiny, hiss, insistent, knitting, enmesh, inky, thingness, synthesize, tiny insights, system, think, sing, yes. And what's emerged from that jumble of letters is a system, a poem. And then the last question is, how does that system interact with its environment, including humans? And it's probably a good thing that we're on Zoom and I can't see all of your reactions. Okay, so systems thinking in chemistry education. This is a global project we initiated 3 years ago to try to see how this idea might help us address sustainability challenges and bring a more holistic perspective to STEM education. It's a project of IUPAC, which Mackenzie mentioned, the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry that sets standards for chemistry. My co-chair of this task group was Stephen Matlin from Imperial College in London. And we invited 24 thought leaders in chemistry and chemistry education from around the world to help us unpack this. And what was mind-boggling was that 24 people said yes. And so we've worked for 2.5 years on the project, trying to look at what's been done in other disciplines to see its relevance for chemistry education. Outcomes have been a special issue last December of the Journal of Chemical Education, the leading journal in the field. And Chemical and Engineering News, the news magazine of the chemical world, never puts chemistry education on their front cover, but they put systems thinking on their front cover in February of this year. We developed a framework for systems thinking in chemistry education, which we published in Nature. It suggests that we put the learner in the middle, and then we look at 3 nodes or subsystems. One is the learner system. What are the theoretical frameworks of learning progressions, the social context for learning, and how do those, what we know about learning, apply to the really unique challenges of learning chemistry, where we have to see things at the molecular level, the symbolic level, and the macroscopic level. And third, and maybe most importantly, what are the elements that orient chemistry education toward meeting societal and environmental needs? And so one of our working groups in that project was focused on Earth and societal systems. And we've developed an idea that was loosely put forward in the literature about 10 years ago and not picked up on, called the molecular basis of sustainability. And this work was also published in Nature Sustainability last year. The flow of ideas goes something like this. We recognize that the flow of matter and energy in society is a core element in sustainability challenges. think about climate change and the need to understand Earth's radiation balance, the greenhouse gases, the chemistry behind them, the planetary boundaries framework, and the fact that many of those control variables are chemical substances, and yet chemists know almost nothing about those connections to sustainability frameworks. So we're trying to shape the practice of chemistry by sustainability science, and then to reorient chemistry education to address the sustainability of Earth and societal systems, to educate about the molecular basis of sustainability using systems thinking. And we define the molecular basis of sustainability as the ways in which the flow of matter and energy, the material basis of our society and economy, underlie considerations of how present and future generations can live within the limits of the natural world. And you might recognize elements of that from the Brundtland Commission definition. So here you go, the most important technological invention of the 20th century, the internet. Maybe. All right, here's an alert for all of you. Molecular world alert. So just bear with me for about 7 minutes because we're going to do just a little bit of chemistry. I don't think it'll be too painful. The most important technological invention of the 20th century, in a debate with one of the computer chip gurus, has been determined by Vaclav Smil at the University of Saskatchewan as the Haber-Bosch process, the process by which nitrogen in the air and hydrogen produce ammonia, fixed nitrogen. Sir William Crookes, the president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1898, did an analysis suggesting that 30% of the world's population, that is 30% of the world's population in civilized countries, those are countries that eat wheat, not rice, stand in deadly peril of not having enough to eat. And he suggested it's the chemist who must come to the rescue of threatened communities. The fixation of atmospheric nitrogen is one of the great discoveries awaiting the ingenuity of chemists. And here's the challenge. Our atmosphere is made up of 78% nitrogen, N2, but that nitrogen-nitrogen triple bond is too strong for almost any plants to metabolize it and turn it into the reactive nitrogen that makes up a lot of plant proteins and amino acids and structural materials, which then end up in the food chain. And it turns out that 1 out of every 2 nitrogen atoms in our bodies has actually come through that industrial process to make fixed nitrogen. And so Vaclav Smil at the University of Manitoba, I'm sorry, I said Saskatchewan, suggested in that debate that the Haber-Bosch synthesis of ammonia is perhaps the most important technological invention of the 20th century, because without this, about 40% of the world's population would not be here. That was in 1999. And yet that single reaction is a failure of systems thinking in chemistry. It's been easy, we've had the resources to make a lot of fixed nitrogen to grow a lot of plants to feed the world. And yet if we tackle chemistry with some of the new important approaches in chemistry, like circular chemistry and green chemistry, and we do an analysis that looks at the nitrogen atoms that we produce in the form of ammonia. If we make 100 ammonia atoms in a molecules in a Haber-Bosch process, 100 nitrogen atoms, by the time we go through all of the steps along the way to a hamburger, 96 of those nitrogen atoms are wasted and only 4 of them make it into our mouths. And if you're a vegetarian, the situation's a little better. 86 of them are wasted and 14 of them make it into our mouths. So this is a failure of systems thinking in chemistry. And equally, in my world of chemistry education, there's a failure of systems thinking in chemistry education, because every textbook that's been around since 1924 has shown the ammonia synthesis in an equilibrium chapter, often with a very sanitized sidebar on Fritz Haber, the Nobel laureate in 1918, who invented the Haber-Bosch process. And classroom treatment of this reaction focuses on mathematical calculations, equilibrium calculations. What happens if you double the amount of nitrogen? How much ammonia do you get? And so on. No connection is usually made between this chemical reaction and either the survival of 40% of our planet's human beings or the threat to our planetary boundaries of our massive fixed nitrogen footprint. So bear with me for just a couple minutes more on chemistry, if you would, because this is an example that we've developed. What would happen if we take that reaction and the way we usually present it and we would zoom out. We do systems thinking. We move out from the trees of isolated facts and try to look at this as a whole. And we've developed on this project some visual tools to do systems thinking. We call them SOCMES, system-oriented concept map extensions, to help us visualize interconnections among system components. And in that work, Tom Holm, who's the editor of the Journal of Chemical Education, has been working with us to try to bring this as a tool to the chemistry education community. So to try to zoom out, to see a system involving that Haber-Bosch reaction, but then of course, because we can't teach all of that in a chemistry course, to learn how to then draw boundaries around a little part of it based on learning outcomes for a particular topic, a course, or a program, focus on them, but constantly do that zooming in and zooming out using systems thinking. And this can help facilitate seeing change over time, cause-effect relationships. So here's what it looks like. This is probably a little small for you on your screen, but here's the core reaction system that's in every chemistry textbook. Hydrogen H2, which is made from natural gas, and nitrogen from the air, make ammonia, and that's kind of as far as we usually go in chemistry textbooks. So if we do a SOCME with this, we can start building out from that system, and we can say now, what are the reaction conditions for making ammonia? We know the starting materials. How do you control that reaction? Well, it turns out you need temperatures above 350 degrees Celsius. And there's a story of 5 or 6 years back in the early 20th century of trying to find the right catalyst. And so we need catalysts, high pressures, high temperature. We need to think about both equilibrium and kinetics. And where did that hydrogen and nitrogen come from? Well, the nitrogen came from air, but we had to separate it out. And the hydrogen, interestingly enough, comes from natural gas, from methane. It's a fossil fuel. And so we make hydrogen to feed the world from fossil fuels right now. And that consumes about 2% of our planet's energy. So Mark Whalen, another colleague at Dalhousie University, worked in industry in the US in ammonia business for 10 years. And he's done some calculations that show to make 1 kilogram of ammonia, we actually consume 3 kilograms of methane and make 3.5 kilograms of CO2. That has a massive energy footprint, 2% of the total energy supply. And so 80% of the cost of ammonia that we use to feed the world is the cost of natural gas. And so he's done an analysis showing that if you try to correlate on the bottom here, the cost of natural gas and oil with a couple of big spikes in 2008 and 2011, with the cost of food and fertilizer, because fertilizers are the single highest operating cost for North Americans and many other farmers. We then have situations where we have these big spikes, and those spikes lead in part, complicated of course, to political unrest and food security issues. And so it's quite certain that some of the causes of things like Arab Spring in 2011 were due to some massive spikes in food and fertilizer costs during that period. We're expanding the system to look at social, economic, environmental issues of poverty. And then what do we do with that ammonia? Well, a lot of it, I'll spare you the details, but a lot of it gets turned into nitric acid. Nitric acid gets turned into ammonium nitrate. That's what blew up in Beirut just a little while ago. We produce that intentionally for fertilizers. So about 80% of our fertilizers are ammonia-based, ammonia, urea, ammonium nitrate for agriculture. And we also produce explosives with ammonia products and ammonium nitrate. And then there are unintended consequences, all of the environmental nitrates, eutrophication and runoff from making way too much reactive nitrogen. And that leads to things like phytoplankton blooms that result from excess nitrate, leads to lack of oxygen and disrupts the ecosystem. So just to summarize then, we've been working in chemistry education on a small part of this core reaction system. That's what we've been introducing our students to. And then we will pick on in other chapters of textbooks on some of these other elements, but we don't see it as systems. And when you put together these core chemistry systems with their use connections, we can begin to see ways in which looking at that as a system can cause emergent understandings of sustainability agendas like the Planetary Boundaries Framework and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So here's the Earth system that relates to reactive nitrogen, the biogeochemical flow of nitrogen. We long ago passed the planetary boundary, the safe value. That was set at 62 teragrams of nitrogen per year of industrial and intentional biological fixation of nitrogen. The current value is 150 teragrams, 2.5 times that value. But of course, these Earth systems are systems, and we have to understand them that way. And so the biogeochemical flow of nitrogen is linked to stratospheric ozone depletion. One of the things that microorganisms in the soil do when we over-fertilize is they make laughing gas, a potent greenhouse gas. Leads to climate change and ozone depletion, biodiversity loss, implications for land use and fresh water. And if we look at the biogeochemical flow of nitrogen and think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, essential to have that fixed nitrogen for fertilizers, for hunger, poverty, good health and well-being. And yet we also use that fixed nitrogen to make explosives, peace and justice, energy for nitrogen fertilizer and for explosives, massive consumption of energy, so affordable and clean energy, climate change, and overproduction of nitrogen fertilizers leads to significant implications for life on land and below and in water. So we start to look at this as a system, and we can help our students understand how the things they experience in terms of sustainability crises, and actually during the pandemic also, they can be equipped to address them if we can back away from the specialization that we're doing and start to look at the whole. So let me end in just a couple of slides here with a few examples of what we're doing just this fall term in several of our chemistry courses at King's to try to bring in the molecular basis of sustainability in general, and then in particular, this whole reactive nitrogen topic. In a senior seminar, we get together with all 3rd and 4th year chemistry students and all faculty in chemistry once a week. And we do a variety of things. One of the things we're doing this fall is we're reading a book called The Alchemy of Air. I'd strongly recommend it to any of you. You don't need to be a chemist to read it. By Thomas Hager. It's, the subtitle is a Jewish genius, a doomed tycoon, and the scientific discovery that fed the world but fueled the rise of Hitler. So everything is connected to everything, and it's a remarkable story of Fritz Haber and Bosch and Albert Einstein and others, and the rise of Nazi Germany. In my general chemistry course, we're just in the unit this week where we're counting atoms. I like to refer to that as chemists, the job of a chemist is to steward atoms, to keep track of all of the atoms we put in at one end of a process and make sure that as many of them as possible come out the other end, and that we take them when that product is done and do circular chemistry to be sure that we're using all of those resources as well as the energy wisely. And this is the whole area of green chemistry and engineering. And in that Chemistry 441 class, Environmental Chemistry of Soils and Water, we have a group of students that have just done a case study, Ashley Eldersma, Angie, on cultural eutrophication and dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. What can we do? And many of these things go back to that reactive nitrogen planetary boundary. And then finally, our 4th year students are all doing research projects, and one of them is focused very specifically on the planetary boundaries. Anna Pattison, an ENVS student, is working with us and with the Stockholm Resilience Institute to further develop this planetary boundaries interactive learning resource. We have Luke Gradanis working with Melanie Hoffman on youth empowering greater climate action, and taking the work that we've done on the Design Our Climate simulation into junior high classrooms. We have another student, Brady Gamroth, who's looking at toxic substances that are found in soils and working with some bioluminescent organisms to measure their toxicity. And then Callie Lesolo is working on one of the most fun projects that I was involved with on my sabbatical, which is working with an amazing team of family members and a retired geologist next door, Bill Gunter, to write a children's energy book called Barely Over the Mountain. The children have to go from Venice to Paris because Venice is flooding to a camp. And they have to pick the locomotive that's going to get them over the Alps. And it's a sustainability story. So we have a brand new IUPAC project that just launched last month. It's called Systems Thinking and Chemistry for Sustainability toward 2030 and beyond. We have 3 threads in it. One is the centrality of the molecular sciences and sustainability science. And so we're engaging with the International Year of Basic Sciences for Sustainable Development. We're trying to develop further the important ideas of systems thinking in chemistry education to carefully understand what they are and how those approaches can be really well used. And then we're discussing with the Committee on Chemistry and Industry ways in which we can foster systems thinking in chemical industry. So I've tried to introduce you tonight to our vision of flourishing in the King's Vision Statement and the need we have to listen to creation groaning. The complexities of doing all of that with pandemic teaching, but also the opportunities that rupture, that dreadful rupture we've experienced has presented to us to rethink what we do in STEM education, to do that more holistically using systems thinking, to try to develop a shared understanding in the global chemistry education community of the importance of attending to the molecular basis of sustainability. And it would be really interesting to learn whether other disciplines can think about, as some of them have already, the economic basis of sustainability, the historical basis of sustainability, and so on and so on. And then some examples from the courses that we're currently teaching. Let me end with a single word for you. It's a Zulu word, Ubuntu. I am because of you. And I am, quite literally, here talking to you tonight because of the generations that have come before me. This is a picture of my mother who passed away 5 years ago at the age of 97, who inspired me by tutoring special needs children until a few months before her death. Here she is at the age of 2, running away from home in Chicago with her suitcase packed. I am a spouse. I am a father and a grandfather because of the love and care and support of Cheryl, of our 3 adult children and their partners and grandchildren. I am a professor because of students like Mackenzie. And finally, what does it mean to think about Ubuntu? What does it mean to think about how the people and the diverse creatures who have yet to be will be because of us? Will they be able to look back and see that we embraced the challenge to know our human imprint, to live within our planetary boundaries in the Anthropocene epoch, and to educate each other for complexity, change, uncertainty, vulnerability, and resilience in the complex age in which we live? So Ubuntu, I am because of you. We are because of those who came before. Those to come will be because of who we are. And because in our faith-based institution at King's, we have a collective belief that we are made to image our Creator. We see all of us as the breath of God to each other and to our planet. So how can we breathe and learn factual and faithful truths so as to respond with integrity to the huge challenges of living faithfully and within our planet's limits as we work out our King's Vision Statement to build a more humane, just, and sustainable world? So let me end there, but let me not forget to just jump back for a quick moment to that Menti slide that we started with. This contribution tonight is a tribute to 5 colleagues. And here is the word cloud that you, the audience, have created for them. Heartfelt thanks for doing that and for being with us tonight. And I'd be really happy to take some questions if you have them.
Thanks very much for that, Dr. Mahaffy, or Dad, as you're more normally known by me when we have Zoom calls. I'll try to get out of our Mahaffy family Zoom mode. If we start doing yoga or something, you'll know why. But I really appreciated that, and I think from some of the comments here, other people did too. One question here, which is, among all the competing voices and issues in education, your examples are hopeful indications of change. Your systems thinking approach is a quintessentially King's liberal arts expression, yet I wonder, what can a tiny place like King's do to further these important approaches to focus? Do you have any strategic advice for our thinking as a faith-based educational body, individually or corporately?
That's a really insightful question, and it's a daunting one. It's, you know, what can we do? It's a little bit like the question, what can we do about the climate crisis? Because we are just individual people and the problem is so great. One of the reflections I would have about that is that I found in my experience that coming into global conversations on science education and responsibility in science and sustainability in science, it has not been in any way a disadvantage to have come from a small faith-based liberal arts institution. In fact, it's in our bones to think interdisciplinarily, to think about where ideas come from, how they change over time, how our belief systems affect the way that we act in the world. And so many of my colleagues who do fabulous work in chemistry do work only on very important specialized problems. And they have less to bring to conversations at a global level on systems thinking and sustainability and the way we educate and the way we do chemistry. And so drawing those folks into conversations is it's an incredibly creative challenge. And it's been so heartening for me to see the way that the global chemistry education community has begun to embrace this. But I'm not naive. I know that bringing about educational change educational change happens at the rate that glaciers move. And glaciers, unfortunately, are moving much more rapidly than they used to. And we're seeing that also in the world of sustainability and chemistry education. So I have found almost nothing along the way that has discouraged me from just putting forward who we are, that interdisciplinary mix we bring, and encouraging people to start thinking about things differently. And slowly over time, these ideas catch on.
Well, I would say too, you know, you're not one to toot your own horn, but you seem to have a penchant for coming from such a small place and bringing these ideas to the broader community. And I think, you know, kudos to you for that, because it's there's a talent there for sure.
But Ruben, just one more comment about that. King's has, from the beginning, set itself up to value the scholarship that faculty do and to encourage all of us, like me, who came out of graduate school with a very specialized mindset and have done very specialized chemistry research over the years, to think outside the box, to walk down the hall and engage with philosophers and historians and artists. And so that's a gift. King's has believed in the importance of scholarship and the importance of working beyond our institution. And they've supported the work that I've done in that regard in just fantastic ways over the years. I'm enormously grateful for that.
I know looking at how things are returning back to classes at King's is a mark of that too, and the creativity and the dedication of all the people there. I see Chris Pete has a question. Go ahead, Chris.
Yes, thanks for that very much, Peter. It was as awesome as expected. My question is the strong emphasis on the importance of Haber-Bosch process and fertilizer, of course, right? Ammonia, fertilizer. So it's sort of a two-part question, and it partly depends on your answer to the first, what the second one becomes. But is the great importance you put on it because of the Green Revolution? And if the answer to that is yes, Right? If the answer is no, then it's going to change things. But if the answer to that is yes, I'm just wondering the way it was presented, and this might be a wrong reading of mine, but the way it was presented in the presentation was a fairly uncritical, endorsement of the usual way of telling the Green Revolution story, as it saved the world from starvation, etc. My understanding in recent years, and some of the stuff I've read, is that is quite false. So my first question is the importance of the Haber-Bosch process and stuff, ammonia and fertilizer, primarily because of the Green Revolution? And if yes, the fact that Green Revolution is in fact, as far as I can tell, quite a myth, like it wouldn't actually undo your presentation, and it certainly would not undo systems thinking. It would, in fact, I think, give you a stronger argument for systems thinking, but in a sort of negative vein relative to the Green Revolution.
Thanks, Chris. And if, let me try to unpack that question this way. First of all, I see the Haber-Bosch process as something that certainly within the world of science, we have just unthinkingly lived with, uncritically lived with. We now use fertilizers to transform the way we produce food, and we do that with industrial agriculture, and the ammonia synthesis and use and urea and ammonium nitrate are really good examples of that. They've had many, if we look back in history, they've had many fantastic benefits in terms of the survival of human beings, and we've paid no attention at all to the downside of that, to the unintended consequences of making massive amounts of reactive nitrogen that far exceed the ability of that life support system, the biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus of Earth to absorb all of that extra nitrogen. And so the very planetary boundaries framework is not well known. It's not well known in this group. It's not well known. It's unheard of in chemistry educators. So here's a fundamentally important chemical substance, and we just don't understand the ways in which it's changing our planetary life support systems. So the revolution in agriculture, yeah, it's been supported in really incredible ways by the development of these fertilizers. And now we're confronting, through things like the planetary boundaries framework and the realization of how far we've exceeded what is sustainable in that regard, the bankruptcy of it. We have to find fundamentally different ways of fertilizing crops, of doing agriculture, of tending the soil. So I don't know if that's getting at your question.
Well, the question was to what if part of the argument is dependent on the Green Revolution story, then the fact that story has come under heavy criticism and it's somewhat false, well, would just adjust your argument a bit. That's all, I think.
So we're bringing somebody into my environmental chemistry class in a couple of weeks who is talking about some very fundamentally different ways of helping plants grow, which pays a lot of attention to symbiosis with microorganisms that are in fact not nitrogen fixers in the soil, that don't produce the nitrous oxide, for instance, that ammonia does. There's a fundamental rethinking taking place, which is not in the public eye at all, about ammonia. Blue ammonia that is currently produced is made from methane, the hydrogen is made from methane, and green ammonia is ammonia where we find other renewable resources to make the hydrogen to produce ammonia. And ammonia is now being explored really seriously as a molecular energy carrier, a way to carry fuel that's non-carbon based to address the climate change challenges of carbon-based fuels. So it's a really complex story moving forward. There's a whole lot we don't know about it, and we have to learn from the lessons of the past.
While you were talking about the Haber-Bosch process too, I heard you mention hydrogen, and I know that's a bit of an interesting thing to look at moving forward, right? Because we see the world is positioned to demand more and more hydrogen in the future, and the Alberta government, Alberta Industries says, hey, we can provide that hydrogen,
Right.
but we're going to produce it by upgrading methane.
Right.
And we'll try to do some carbon capture, and it should be all great, right? And that would be an example of, as you said, blue hydrogen, right? What do we do with those kinds of situations where it's marginally better than what we have, but it's not even the best way to produce hydrogen environmentally? And how should we respond to those sorts of situations?
Maybe one of the most important things about that development is there are people in Alberta talking for the first time about hydrogen. And then it's not so hard to begin to get people thinking and talking about where that hydrogen comes from. We simply cannot continue to burn fossil fuels in the way that we have. And so it may be a reasonable transition for a short period of time to very, very seriously use methane to produce hydrogen with essentially complete capture of the CO2 that's produced. And then ideally not pumping it deep underground, carbon capture and storage, but utilizing it for the production of feedstocks and so on. That's got to be short term and very short term, because clearly what we have to be doing is moving to sustainable sources of energy to make the hydrogen. Hydrogen is probably a molecular substance that, certainly a molecular substance that we're going to need to power our planet with. Its energy density is incredible. We've got all sorts of ways that we can use it that are pretty sustainable. We can't do it all with, this resource we've developed, Design Our Climate, looks at the mix of things we need to do to reach the Paris Accord, and solar won't do it by itself, and wind won't do it by itself, and nuclear won't do it by itself, and carbon capture and storage won't do it by itself. It's very clear we have to phase out fossil fuel combustion, but then it's a complicated mix of all of those other strategies technologically that will get us to 1.5 degrees by 2050.
I've just added a link to that Design Our Climate tool, yeah, that you mentioned. And I saw you added the Planetary Boundaries tool as well. If anybody is looking for the main KCVS site where you can find those and more, I'll put that into the chat as well. And I would expect most of this group is familiar with the work of KCVS, but if not, that's an excellent way to spend the next half an hour after you log off of this call.
Pour yourself a glass of red wine and visit the Planetary Boundaries.
And then when you can't actually make it work without finessing all of those tiny little wedges, you pour your second glass of wine, and then maybe your third, and then you're not quite so pleased with the world after that. Are there any other questions from the Zoom viewers? If I don't see any more in the chat, but if there's anybody who wants to unmute themselves, they could do so. And I know, I think one final question that I have maybe is, seeing no others, we are in the midst of this huge disruption due to COVID. And as you mentioned, there are opportunities in that and there are challenges in that. And we don't necessarily want to just return to normal, but there are many who are very eager to return to normal, or as normal as we can. My work as a high school teacher, that's the number one goal, is to return to normal. I'm already back essentially in a normal environment, except with face masks and a jug of hand sanitizer at the front. So how do we avoid just slipping back into normal when and as we can? And how do we take advantage of this disruption and use this as a tool, rather than squandering this opportunity?
Yeah. In the world, Ruben, of university chemistry educators, the thing that I push for, which seems to be a necessary but not sufficient condition to get there, is that we need to pull folks together and just think about what we want. Think about, in most cases, for the first time. What is it that we want students who take, for instance, first-year chemistry, or who take a chemistry program or organic chemistry, what do we want them to know, to do, and to value at the end of that learning experience? Those are articulations of broad stroke learning outcomes. And my colleagues don't think about that very often. And if they do, they'll come up with a list of very detailed learning outcomes, all of which are important, or many of which are important. You know, I've got to be able to do acid-base calculations of this sort, and equilibrium calculations and things in the lab and so on. But to start with outcomes that say the molecular sciences are, the flow of matter and energy are at the heart of sustainability challenges. What do we want students to know, do, and value at the end of their exposure to the amazing world of molecules, that helps them understand the beauty of that world, that helps them understand the incredible power of that world to be used for really good purposes. And then, as Mackenzie knows, the power of that world to also be used for destructive purposes in things like the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So where teams can actually form, instead of, you know, faculty members coming in and pulling out the things that they've been doing for the last 20 years with very little change, where teams can come together and intentionally think about who it is that we teach and what their learning needs are as we emerge from a pandemic. What rises to the top of that is we need to educate for complexity and change. And specialization only doesn't do that. We have to be able to see systems and see what we do in a specialized way. We don't throw away specialization. We see the interconnections among the specialized knowledge we have with other domains.
Well, thank you. And I see Dr. Pete snuck in there. If by normal we mean the IPCC notion of pre-industrial global temperature normal, then he's all for it. Of course, if only.
How many billion people did we have then, Chris? Yeah, that's the challenge. Yep. Yeah, that's a normal we'd really like to get back to.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I don't know if Kathleen, sure.
Yeah, I'll come back on for a minute. So thank you, Peter and Mackenzie and Ruben, for this informative and thought-provoking and engaging lecture, and providing us a vision for flourishing. I also really enjoyed hearing about the King's student research. I hadn't heard some of those things before, so I appreciated hearing about that. Next week for our public lectures, we have Dr. Glory Ovey, who's a new faculty member in our education department, who will be lecturing and sharing about the demands of a leader in crisis and the set of abilities not used in normal day-to-day leadership. In her lecture, Dr. Ovey will be exploring the competencies needed to manage a crisis. We could have had this lecture a while ago, I think. You can find the link to sign up for her lecture and the rest of our Educating for Life series on our King's website. You are also welcome to join us online this Saturday evening for our first ever, and hopefully never again, virtual harvest banquet. Our 2019 distinguished alumni, Dr. Robert Gadanis, will be a keynote speaker for the evening. Alumna Justine Vandergriff will be providing some musical entertainment, and will be presenting our 2020 Alumni Achievement Awards. You'll also find the link on the King's website to sign up for this. We also have an online silent auction where you could bid on a backyard barbecue with Dr. Humphreys at her home, a River Valley Walk and sustainability discussion with Dr. Joanne Meyer, which is currently at $275. A gorgeous painting by artist Jim Vischer, a homemade sourdough bread description from Micah Center's director, Jonathan Nikolai de Koning, and even a fly fishing trip on the west coast to Vancouver Island with King's alumnus, Jesse Montez. The banquet is free to come to this year, but we appreciate all your donations. As I mentioned earlier, Mackenzie helped us raise $50,000 last year for student scholarships, and we're well on our way for this year. all the proceeds from our silent auction and donations for the evening will go again towards student scholarships to help more students access King's quality education. So thank you everyone for coming out this evening. We hope to see you on Saturday night at the banquet and then again next week as well. Have a great evening and thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Good. Well, thank you, Peter, for doing that. How did you feel it went?
It was a great group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So thanks for the opportunity. Nice to bring in some the King's community together with some from outside, and I really appreciate that mix.
Yeah. Well, thank you. All right, and so this will be available online probably in about a week's time. We do a little bit of editing and then it's available. But I was also thinking, I texted Shannon while we were watching it because he's doing fundraising for the King's Center for Visualization and Science. Is that how to say it? And I thought, that, oh, this would be, elements of this lecture would be perfect for that audience as they do fundraising. So,
Yep.
Yeah, so good.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Ashley.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Have a good night.
All right. Have a
Good night.
Bye-bye.